There's something interesting about the way many of us postpone the things that matter most. It usually doesn't look like avoidance. It doesn't even look like fear. Most of the time, it looks responsible. So we tell ourselves we'll begin later. Later when life settles down. Later when we feel more prepared. Later when we feel more confident. And those reasons sound reasonable because we're not saying never, we're just saying not yet. But what most people don't realize is that waiting has a hidden cost, not just in time, but in energy, in momentum, and in the quiet weight that builds when something inside you knows you're postponing what matters. And often the real reason we wait has very little to do with timing. It has much more to do with something else, the fear of beginning, and sometimes more specifically, the fear of failing publicly. My name is Caren, and this is The Rewrite, a podcast about finding the courage to pursue the life you already know you're meant to live. Because most people don't struggle with recognizing that something in their life needs attention. The struggle usually comes when it's time to respond to it. And that moment, the moment of beginning, is where hesitation quietly takes hold. Beginning something meaningful is uncomfortable, not because we lack ability and not because we lack ideas, but because the moment we begin something that matters to us, it becomes visible. And once something becomes visible, it also becomes vulnerable. When something stays an idea in your mind, it feels safe. No one can critique it, no one can misunderstand it, no one can even see the parts that are still unfinished. But the moment you begin to act on it, whether that's writing, speaking, creating, building, or changing direction in your life, the possibility of failure becomes real. And that possibility alone is enough to make many people pause. Not permanently, just long enough that postponement begins to feel quite normal. Fear rarely introduces itself honestly. It doesn't usually say, "Hey, I'm afraid to begin." Instead, it shows up disguised as logic. It sounds more like, "I need preparation. I should probably wait until I'm better at this, or I'll start something when everything is organized." And again, those thoughts sound responsible. They sound thoughtful. They even sound wise at times. But sometimes what we're actually doing is protecting ourselves from the possibility of doing something imperfectly in front of other people. Because once something becomes visible, it invites opinion, it invites criticism, and sometimes it invites misunderstanding. So we wait. Not because we lack desire, but because beginning means allowing ourselves to be seen while we're still learning these things. And I understand this hesitation more than I used to admit. For many years, I knew there were things I felt drawn toward, like speaking and writing, encouraging people to think differently about their lives. Those ideas were never absent, they were always there, quietly present in the background. But knowing something internally and acting on it externally are two very different things. Because once you begin sharing something publicly, it changes the dynamic. Your ideas are no longer private. Your voice is no longer hidden. And the possibility of failing in front of other people suddenly becomes real. And that was something I had to wrestle with myself. Not because I lacked conviction about what I wanted to do, but because stepping into something meaningful often requires stepping into visibility. And visibility can feel uncomfortable, especially when you care deeply about what you're creating. One of the reasons waiting is so difficult to recognize is because it doesn't always look dramatic. In fact, waiting can blend very easily into everyday life. You still go to work, you still take care of responsibilities, you still show up for the people who depend on you. And from the outside, everything can appear completely normal, and in many ways it is. But internally, there can be a quiet awareness that something meaningful has been sitting on the sidelines. Maybe it's something creative. Maybe it's a direction you've thought about exploring. Maybe it's a skill you've always wanted to develop, but never quite made space for. And over time, you begin to treat that part of yourself like something optional, something you'll return to when life becomes less busy. But the truth is that life rarely becomes less busy. Now, think about it. Responsibilities change, circumstances shift, new obligations appear, and the longer something meaningful remains postponed, the easier it becomes to continue postponing it. Not because you stop caring, but because postponement slowly becomes familiar. Now, the cost of waiting rarely shows up in obvious ways. There isn't usually a single moment where someone suddenly realizes they've waited too long. Instead, the cost appears gradually. It shows up as a quiet tension in our lives, a sense that we're moving forward but not fully expanding. We continue fulfilling our responsibilities, we do the things we're supposed to do, but somewhere inside us, there's an awareness that something meaningful is still sitting on the sidelines. And ignoring that awareness requires energy. Energy to rationalize the delay, energy to convince ourselves that waiting is still the best choice. And over time, that quiet tension can become heavier than the fear that caused the waiting in the first place. One of the biggest reasons fear of beginning is so powerful is because of how deeply human it is. Most of us care about how we're perceived. So we want to be respected, we want to be understood, and we don't want to look foolish or unprepared in front of other people. So when an opportunity appears that might expose us to judgment, our instinct is often to slow down, to wait a little longer, to make sure we're completely ready. But here's a difficult truth many people eventually discover. There is no version of beginning something meaningful where you feel completely ready. Every person who eventually becomes skilled at something once started in a place of uncertainty. Every person who eventually became confident or becomes confident once experienced hesitation. And every person who eventually creates something meaningful had to begin at a point where they still were trying to figure everything out. That's simply the nature of growth. Growth doesn't always begin with mastery. It begins with movement, and movement almost always requires stepping forward before we can be fully prepared. That doesn't mean recklessness, and it doesn't mean abandoning responsibilities or turning your life completely upside down overnight. Often, it simply means allowing yourself to explore something you've been postponing, to take one step, to test an idea, to begin learning. Because the truth is that clarity rarely appears while we're still standing still. Clarity tends to appear after we begin moving. And sometimes the most powerful shift in our lives doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from giving ourselves permission to begin before we have them. So here's something worth reflecting on for a moment. Is there something in your life that you've been postponing? Not because it doesn't matter, but because it matters enough that the possibility of failing becomes visibly public and uncomfortable. Maybe it's a dream you've carried quietly, a skill you wanted to develop, or a path you felt drawn toward but haven't fully stepped into it yet. And if that's the case, ask yourself something honestly. How long have you been telling yourself later? And what might change in your life if you decided that beginning imperfectly was still better than waiting indefinitely? Because sometimes the most important shift we can make isn't becoming fearless, it's simply becoming willing. Recognizing the hidden cost of waiting can be a powerful moment of clarity, not because it forces immediate change, but because it invites honesty. And honesty is often where real movement begins. And that's exactly what this podcast is here to explore. If this episode gave you something to reflect on, subscribe, follow, and continue with me into the next one. I'd like to sincerely thank you for being here with me today. And I hope you are able to take something meaningful with you from this episode and other episodes prior, and hopefully many more episodes to come. This is The Rewrite because your story isn't finished yet.